Chapter 6. Liusu just ignored him. He was careful all the way, talking and laughing in a low voice. When she arrived at the hotel, her expression softened, and the two of them went back to their rooms to settle down. Liusu thought to himself that it turned out that Fan Liuyuan was very particular about spiritual love. She actually agreed, because the result of spiritual love is always marriage, while physical love often stops at a certain stage, with little hope of marriage. There's only one problem with spiritual love: women often don't understand what men say during the relationship. But that doesn't matter much. Later, it's always about getting married, finding a house, buying furniture, hiring people. Women are much better at those things than men. When she thought about it, she didn't take it to heart today's little misunderstanding. Liusu leaned over to look at it, and Liuyuan leaned over to point. Across the green glass, Liusu suddenly felt his eyes looking at her with a half smile. She put down her cup and smiled. Liuyuan said, "I will accompany you to Malaya." Liusu asked, "What to do?" Liuyuan said, "Go back to nature." He changed his mind and added, "It's just one piece. I can't imagine you running in the forest wearing a cheongsam, but I can't imagine you not wearing a cheongsam either." Liusu quickly lowered his face and said, "Stop talking nonsense." Liuyuan said, "I'm serious. The first time I saw you, I felt that you shouldn't be shirtless and wearing such a fashionable long vest, but you shouldn't wear a suit either. The Manchurian flag dress may be more appropriate, but the lines are too hard." Liusu said, "In short, people are ugly. No matter how they dress up, they don't look pleasing to the eye." Liuyuan said with a smile, "Don't misunderstand me again. What I mean is, you don't look like a person in this world. You have many little tricks. There is a romantic atmosphere, very much like singing Peking opera." Liusu raised his eyebrows and sneered, "I can't sing opera by myself. Why do I like to be pretentious? This is also a challenge. People are playing tricks on me, but if I don't play tricks on them, they still treat me like a fool." "You fool. You will definitely find me to bully you." Liuyuan felt a little sad after hearing this. He raised the empty glass, tried to take a sip, then put it down and sighed. "Yes, it's all my fault. I'm used to pretending, and it's also because everyone pretends to me. Only to you, I said something. Tell the truth. You can't hear it." Liusu said, "I'm not the roundworm in your belly." Liuyuan said, "Yes, it's all my fault. But I did spend a lot of effort on you. When I first met you in Shanghai, I thought that after leaving those people in your family, you might be more natural. It's so easy to look forward to it after you arrived in Hong Kong. Now, I want to take you to Malaya, to the forest of the primitive people." He laughed at himself. His voice was hoarse and bitter, and before he finished laughing, he called his servant and I. "The bill comes." When they came out after paying the bill, he had recovered himself and resumed his best flirtation, most refined kind. The next morning, she heard the silence in Mrs. Zhu's room and knew that she must have gotten up very late. Mrs. Zhu seems to have said that the rules here are that if you order breakfast in the room, you have to pay and give a small bill. So Liusu decided to save a little for others and go to the cafeteria. After she finished washing herself, as soon as she stepped out of the room, a servant waiting outside saw her and knocked on Fan Liuyuan's door. Liuyuan immediately walked out and said with a smile, "Let's have breakfast together." As he walked, he asked, "Mr. Zhu and Mrs. Zhu haven't raised the bill yet?" Liusu smiled and said, "They were too tired from playing yesterday. I didn't hear them coming back. It must have been near dawn." They found a table in the corridor outside the dining room and sat down. Tall palm trees grow outside the stone railing, and their scattered leaves tremble slightly in the sun like bright fountains. There is also a fountain under the tree, but it's not that magnificent. Liuyuan asked, "What are Mrs. Zhu and the others planning to do today?" Liusu said, "I heard they are looking for a house." Liuyuan said, "They look for their house, and we play with ours. Do you like to go to the beach or go to the city?" Liusu had used a telescope to look at the nearby beach the afternoon before. The men and women were indeed very lively, but she was a little wary of being able to move a little too freely, so she suggested going into the city. They caught a bus specially provided by the hotel and arrived in the central area. Only once, on the beach. At this time Liusu knew more about Liuyuan and thought it would be okay to go to the beach, so they went there to spend the morning. They sat side by side on the sand, but one faced east and the other faced west. Tassel shouts that there are mosquitoes. Yanagihara said, "It's not a mosquito, it's a small insect called a sand fly. When you bite it, you'll see a small red dot, like a cinnabar mole." Liusu said again, "The sun is really unbearable," Liuyuan said. "After a while, we can go under the pergola. I rented a shed there." The thirsty sun sucked in the seawater, gargling, spitting, and making a splashing sound. It drinks up all the water in a person's body, turning him into a golden withered leaf, light and airy. Liusu gradually felt the strange dizziness and pleasure, but she couldn't help shouting again, "Mosquito bite." She turned her head and slapped her bare back. Yanagi-yuan laughed and said, "It's so hard. I'll do it for you. And you can do it for me." As expected, Liusu paid attention and hit him on the arm, shouting, "Oh, let it run away." Liuyuan also paid attention for her. The two of them were playing and laughing. Liusu was suddenly offended, stood up and walked back to the hotel. Yanagi-yuan did not follow this time. Liusu walked to the shade of the tree, on the stone path between the two reed mat tents, stopped, shook the sand off her short skirt, and looked back. Liuyuan was still in the same place, lying on his back, with his hands under his neck. Apparently he was dreaming about the sun again, and he was tanned into golden leaves again. Liusu returned to the hotel and looked out of the window with the binoculars again. This time, there was a woman lying next to him, with braids on her head. So he burned Nasa Haisini to ashes, and Liusu also knew her. Yanagi-yuan took her to eat in Greater China. When Liusu heard that the servants all spoke Shanghai's, and the 4 local accents filled his ears, he was surprised and asked, "This is a Shanghai restaurant." He ran around with her every day and saw everything: movies, Cantonese opera, casinos, Gloucester Hotel, Saihao Hotel, Bluebird Cafe, Indian silks, Sichuan food in Kowloon. They often went out for walks in the evening, until late at night. She couldn't believe it herself. He barely even touched her hand. She was always on tenterhooks, fearing that he would suddenly take off his mask and attack her unexpectedly. However, day after day passed, and he maintained his gentlemanly demeanor. She was facing a formidable enemy, but nothing happened. She felt uneasy at first, as if she had missed a step when going down the stairs. She felt extremely nervous, but later she got used to it. After finishing the meal, Liuyuan raised the glass and drank the remaining tea in one gulp. He held the glass high and just looked inside. Liusu said, "If there is anything to see, let me see it." Liuyuan said, "Look at Liang and take a look. The scenery inside reminds me of the forest in Malay." The remaining tea in the cup was tilted to one side. The green tea leaves stuck to the glass, slanting horizontally and facing the light, looking like a green banana plant. The tea leaves piled underneath were knotted together like knee-deep vines and basil. From that day on, Yanagihara hung out with Sahishini all day long. He must have made up his mind to cool Tassel. Liusu was used to going out every day, but suddenly he was free. He couldn't explain the reason in front of Mrs. Zhu, so he had to catch a cold and sit in the house for 2 days. Fortunately, God was wise, and it started raining again, so I had more excuses, so I didn't need to go out. One afternoon, she came back from a circle in the hotel garden holding an umbrella. It was getting dark, and it was time to come back from meeting Mrs. The umbrella was opened and placed across the railing, covering her face. The umbrella has a pink ground and a stone green lotus leaf pattern, and water droplets slide down from the ribs. It was raining heavily, and there was the sound of cars driving in the rain. A group of men and women came up the steps, laughing and joking, pushing each other arm in arm. The leader was Fan Liuyuan. Sahaisini was being held by him, but she was in a very awkward state, with a little bit of mud splashing on her bare legs. She took off her big straw hat and sprinkled water all over the floor. Yanagihara caught a glimpse of the tasseled umbrella and said a few words to Sahishini on the escalator. Sahishini went upstairs alone. Yanagihara came over, took out his handkerchief and kept wiping the water stains on his face. Son. Liusu couldn't help but exchange a few words with him. Liuyuan sat down and said, I heard that Zunian wasn't feeling well 2 days ago? Liusu said, it's just a heat cold. Liuyuan said, the weather is really boring. We went to have a picnic on the British yacht just now and drove the boat to Qingyi Island. Liusu casually asked him about the scenery of Qingyi Island. Just as she was talking, Sahishini came downstairs again. She had changed into Indian clothes and was wearing a goose yellow shawl that reached to the ground. The shawl is covered with silver threads about 2 inches wide and decorated with flowers. She also leaned against the railing, picked a table far away and sat down. One hand resting on the back of the chair, her nails painted with silver khaki. Liusu smiled at Liuyuan and said, why don't you go there? Liuyuan said with a smile, I have a master. Liusu said, how can the old Englishman control her? Liuyuan smiled and said, he can't control her, but you can control me. Liusu pursed his lips and smiled and said, hey, I am the governor of Hong Kong, the city god of Hong Kong. I am in charge of the people here, but I can't control you. Liuyuan shook his head and said, a woman who is not jealous. How much can she do? A little morbid. Liusu chuckled. After a while, Liusu asked, what are you looking at me for? Liuyuan smiled and said, let me see if you are prepared to treat me better from now on. Liusu said, if I treat you better or worse, why would you care? Liuyuan clapped his hands and said, this sounds like a sentence. There seems to be a hint of sourness in his voice. Liusu couldn't hold it back and laughed loudly. I've never seen someone like you, who was begging for nothing and making people jealous. Yanagihara smiled and said, don't you miss home? Liusu smiled and said, but it always seems a bit silly to make a special trip to Hong Kong to eat Shanghai's food. Liuyuan said, when I'm with you, I like to do all kinds of stupid things. Even riding the tram in circles and watching a movie I've seen twice. Liusu said, because you were infected by me, silly, isn't it? Liuyuan smiled and said, explain it however you like. Chapter 7. On the boat, they had many opportunities to get close, but Yanagihara could resist the moonlight on the deck just as he could resist the moonlight in Repulse Bay. He never had a solid word to say to her. His attitude was a bit indifferent, but Liusu could see that his leisure was a kind of complacent leisure. He held her firmly and she couldn't jump out of his palm. Liusu looked at him in surprise, suddenly realizing how vicious he was. He deliberately acted affectionate in front of others so that she could not prove that they had not had a relationship. She was riding a tiger, unable to return to her hometown, unable to see her parents, and had no other option except to be his mistress. However, if she gives in to him, not only will all her previous efforts be wasted, but she will also be doomed in the future. She doesn't, even if she was in vain. He just took advantage of her verbally. After all, he still didn't get her. Since he didn't get her, maybe he would come back to her one day and bring better peace terms. She made up her mind and told Liuyuan that she planned to return to Shanghai. However, Yanagihara refused to stay and volunteered to send her back. Liusu said, that's not necessary. Aren't you going to Singapore? Liuyuan said, it's been delayed anyway. It doesn't matter if we delay it for a while longer. There are things waiting to be taken care of in Shanghai. Liusu knew that he still had the same policy and was afraid that everyone would not talk about them. The more conclusive and evidence-based everyone's claims are, the more indefensible Liusu is, and naturally he cannot find a place in Shanghai. Liusu figured that even if he didn't send her back, nothing would be hidden from her family. She was willing to risk everything, so she let him give her a ride. Mrs. Su was surprised when she saw that the two of them were fighting fiercely and suddenly wanted to separate. She asked Liusu and Liuyuan. Although the two of them said they wanted to protect each other in unison, how could Mrs. Su believe it? Liusu pondered for a long time and couldn't help but get annoyed and said, you might as well just say you don't want to get married, and that's the end of it. You still have to go through a big detour. Why can't you be the master? Even a conservative family like me still says, when you first marry, You obey the mother. If you remarry, please follow the rules. For a free-spirited person like you, you can't make the decision yourself. Who will make the decision for you? Liuyuan said coldly. If you don't love me, what can you do? Can you make the decision? Liusu said. If you really love me, can you still take care of this? Liuyuan said. I'm not that confused. I don't have to spend money to marry someone who has no feelings for me to control me. That's too unfair for you. That's not fair. Oh, maybe you don't care. You basically think that marriage is long-term prostitution. Liusu didn't wait for him to finish and took off the earphones with a snap. His face flushed with anger. How dare he insult her like this? He dares. She sat on the bed, the hot darkness wrapping her in a great purple velvet blanket. I was covered in sweat and itchy, and the hair on my neck and back felt irritated and uncomfortable. She put her hands on her cheeks, but their palms were cold. When Liusu thought of this, he gritted his teeth and let out a sigh of hatred. On the face of it, I still dealt with him as usual. Mrs. Su has rented a house in Happy Valley and is about to move there. Liusu wanted to follow her, but felt that she had disturbed her for more than a month in vain and felt embarrassed to have to stay longer. It wouldn't be a problem if the stalemate continued like this. In a dilemma, I hesitated. That day, late at night, she had been in bed for a long time, just tossing and turning. After finally being hazy for a while, the phone next to the bed suddenly rang loudly. When she heard it, it was Liuyuan's voice, saying, I love you. Just hung up. Liusu's heart was beating loudly. He held the earphones and was stunned for a while before gently putting them back into place. Unexpectedly, when I put it on the phone, the ringing started ringing again. She picked up the receiver again. And Liuyuan asked there, I forgot to ask you. Do you love me? Liusu coughed before speaking again, but his throat was still hoarse. She whispered, You should have known a long time ago. Why did I come to Hong Kong? Liuyuan sighed. I knew it a long time ago, but I just don't want to believe the obvious facts. Liusu, you don't love me? Liusu asked. How come I'm not there? Liuyuan remained silent for a long time and then said, There is a poem in the book of songs. Liusu said hurriedly. I don't understand this. Liuyuan said impatiently, I know you don't understand. If you did, there would be no need for me to explain it. I'll read it to you. The life and death agreement is broad. Be happy with your son. Hold your hand and grow old together with your son. My Chinese is not good at all, but I don't know if the explanation is correct. I think it is the saddest poem. Life, death and farewell are all major events that are not under our control. Compared with the power of the outside world, we are so small. How small? But we insist on saying, I will always be with you and we will never leave you for the rest of our lives. As if we have the final say. When he arrived in Shanghai, he sent her home without getting out of the car. There had already been reports in Baigongwan that the sixth miss was living together with Fan Liuyuan in Hong Kong. Now she has been playing with them for more than a month, and then she comes back. As if nothing happened, clearly intending to embarrass the Bai family. Tassel changed his color. Yanagi Yuan stroked his chin with his hand and said with a smile, Don't bear this false reputation in vain. The two reconciled immediately and had dinner together. Although Liusu was a little warmer to him on the surface, she was aware of it in her heart. He made her jealous because he was just using provocation to force her to throw herself into his arms. She had been dissatisfied with him a long time ago, and she was dissatisfied with him later. She chose this moment to get along with him, sacrificing herself in vain. He must not be grateful. He just thought that she had fallen into his trap. She would never dream of him marrying her. It's obvious that he wants her, but he doesn't want to marry her. However, even though her family was poor, it was still a prominent family. And everyone was on the scene, so he could not bear the charge of seduction. So he took that aboveboard approach. She knew now that it was a complete lie. He tries to shirk responsibility at every turn. If she was abandoned in the future, she would have absolutely no one to complain to. She didn't dare to ask him the next morning, because he would definitely laugh at her. Dreams are thoughts in the heart. She missed him so desperately that he would even call and say I love you in her sleep. His attitude was no different from usual. They went out for a day as usual. Liusu suddenly realized that there were many people who regarded them as a couple, the servants and the ladies who chatted with her in the hotel. I don't blame them for misunderstanding. Yanagi Yuan lived next door to her, always walking side by side when going in and out, and even went for walks on the coast late at night, not avoiding suspicion at all. A nanny pushed a child's car past, nodded to Liusu, and called Mrs. Fan. Liusu's face froze, neither smiling nor not smiling. He could only glance at Liuyuan with a frown, and whispered, "They don't know what they are thinking." Liuyuan said with a smile, "The person who calls you Mrs. Fan, ignore them and call you Miss Bai. I don't know what they think." The bell rang again. She didn't answer the phone and let it ring. The ringing. The sound was extremely deafening. In the silent room, in the silent hotel, in the silent Repulse Bay. Liusu suddenly realized that she could not wake up the entire Repulse Bay hotel. First, Mrs. Zhu was next door. She gingerly picked up the receiver and put it on the mattress, but the surroundings were too quiet. Even though they were so far away, she could still hear Liuyuan's voice saying calmly, "Liusu, can you see the moon in your window?" Liusu didn't know why, but suddenly choked up. The moon in the tearful eyes was large and blurry, silvery, with green edges. Liuyuan said, "On my side, there is a wisteria hanging above the window, blocking half of it. Maybe it's a rose, maybe not." He stopped talking, but the phone never hung up. For a long time, Liusu suspected that he had fallen asleep, but he finally made a sound and hung up gently. Liusu picked up her receiver from the sheets with trembling hands and put it back on the shelf. She was afraid that he would call a fourth time, but he didn't. "This is all a dream. The more I think about it, the more it looks like a dream." Liusu hooked up with Fan Liuyuan just for his money. Even if he really got the money, he wouldn't come home quietly. Obviously, he didn't get any benefits. Originally, a woman should be deceived if she is deceived by a man. If a woman is deceived by a man, she is even more of an adulterer. If a woman fails to deceive a man and is deceived by someone else, then she is a double evil. Killing her also stained the knife. Usually in Bai Mansion, if anyone makes a big mistake, everyone will explode. When encountering a truly shocking treason, the grandparents were so excited that the 8ii were speechless for a while. Everyone first agreed family scandals should not be made public. Then they went separately to tell relatives and friends, forcing them to swear an oath to keep the secret. Then they asked relatives and friends one by one to find out whether they knew and how much they knew. In the end, everyone felt that they couldn't hide it anymore. So they simply opened up the skylight and spoke frankly, patting their legs and sighing with emotion. They were busy with these various procedures and had been busy all autumn, so they were slow to take decisive action against Liusu. Liusu didn't know that her return this time would be even worse than before. She had long since severed all ties with this family. She didn't want to go out to find a small job and mess around with a bowl of rice. No matter how miserable it is better than being miserable at home. But if she finds a lowly career, she loses her identity as a lady. That identity is tasteless to eat and a pity to throw away. Especially now, she has not yet despaired of Fan Liuyuan. She cannot devalue herself first, otherwise he will have even more excuses, refuse to marry her. So she had to endure it for a while anyway. Chapter 8. She staggered to the next room. Empty rooms, one after another, an emptied world. She felt like she could fly to the ceiling. She walked on the empty floor as if on a dust-free ceiling. The room was too empty, so she had to fill it up with light. The light was still not enough, and she had to remember to replace it with some stronger light bulbs tomorrow. The next day he told her that he was going to England in a week. She asked him to take her with him, but he replied that that was impossible. He proposed to rent a house for her to live in Hong Kong, and after a year and a half, he came back. If she wants to live in Shanghai, that's up to her. Of course she refused to go back to Shanghai. Those people at home, the further away from them the better. Staying alone in Hong Kong will make you feel lonely. The question is whether the situation has changed when he comes back. That's all up to him. Can a week of love hold his heart? But on the other hand, Liuyuan is a person with no long-term personality. They gather and disperse in such a hurry. He has no chance to get tired of her, which is not beneficial to her. A week is often more memorable than a year. If he really comes back to her with passionate memories, she may have changed. Women in their late 30s are often unusually delicate and look haggard in the blink of an eye. In short, it is difficult, painful, almost impossible to hold on to a man for a long time without the protection of marriage. Never mind it. She admits that Liuyuan is cute and he gives her wonderful stimulation, but her purpose with him is financial security. Of this, she knew she could rest assured. Together they looked at a house on Barton Road, located on a hillside. The house was painted, a Cantonese maid named Ollie was hired, and only a few important pieces of furniture were purchased. It was time for Liuyuan to leave. The rest was left to Liusu to pick up slowly. The family hadn't opened a barn yet, so on that winter evening, when Liusu sent him aboard, he ate some sandwiches in the large dining room on the ship. Liusu was filled with dissatisfaction, so she drank a few more glasses of wine and was blown away by the sea breeze. When she came back, she was very drunk. When she got home, Ollie boiled water in the kitchen to wash the feet of the child she was taking with her. Liusu looked round and turned on the lights here and there. The green paint on the doors and windows in the living room was not dry yet. She touched it with her index finger and then put her sticky fingertips on the wall, leaving green marks on each one. Why not? This is not illegal. This is her home. She smiled and simply put a bright green handprint on the dandelion yellow wall. His mouth never left hers. He also pushed her towards the mirror, and they seemed to have fallen into the mirror, into another dim world. Feeling cold and hot, with wild sparks burning all over their bodies, the phone call that night was indeed from him. It was not a dream. He loves her. This vicious person. He loves her, but he only treats her like this. She couldn't help but feel chilled, turned around and walked to the dressing table. The slender moon at the end of November is just a streak of white, like frost flowers on the glass window. However, there is a hint of moonlight on the sea, and when it is reflected in the window, the thin light illuminates the mirror. Liusu slowly took off her hairnet, stirred up her hair, and the hairpin fell to the ground with a clink. She put on the hairnet again, held the tip of the hairnet tightly in her mouth, whereupon her eyebrows squatted down and picked up the hairpins one by one. Liuyuan had already walked behind her with bare feet and picked up the hairpins one by one. He put his hand on her head, turned her face upside down, and kissed her mouth. The hairnet slipped to the ground. By the end of November, Fan Liuyuan received a telegram from Hong Kong. The telegram had been circulated to everyone in the Bai mansion. The old lady just called Liusu over and handed it to her. There are only a few words, begging to come to Hong Kong. The ferry ticket has been processed by Travelex. He reserved the original room for her. That night, it was already 2 o'clock when she came back to the room. After putting on her evening makeup in the bathroom, she turned off the lights and came out. She just remembered that the light switch in her room was installed on the bedside, so she had to come over in the dark. Tripped over a leather shoe on the floor and almost fell down. I fell down, blaming my negligence for not putting away my shoes. Suddenly someone on the bed laughed and said, "Don't be scared. They are my shoes." Liusu paused for a while and asked, "What are you doing here?" Liuyuan said, "I've always wanted to look through your window. Moon, you can see more clearly from this side of the room than from that side." Fan Liuyuan greeted her on the pier in the drizzle. He said that the green glass raincoat looked like a bottle, and added, "Medicine bottle." She thought he was mocking her weakness, but he added another sentence, "You are the medicine that heals me." She blushed and rolled her eyes at him. This was the first time he kissed her, but both of them wondered if it wasn't the first time since it had happened countless times in their fantasies. They had had many opportunities in the past, the right environment, the right mood. He had thought about it, and she had also considered the possibility. However, both parties are very capable people. They have calculated their calculations too carefully and are still unwilling to make any mistake. Now this suddenly became true, and both of them were confused. Liusu felt her body spin around in a circle and fall against the mirror, her vest pressed tightly against the cold mirror. She went up the stairs, so empty. She desperately needed absolute silence. She was very tired, and it was too difficult to please Liuyuan. He had always had a weird temper towards her, but because he had real feelings for her, he became even weirder and unhappy. It would be better if he left, letting her breathe a sigh of relief. She doesn't want anyone now, not a pretty person, not a lovely person. She doesn't want anyone. Ever since she was a child, her world had felt too crowded. Pushing, squeezing, stepping on, carrying, holding, and carrying. Old and young, they are all human beings. A family of about 20 lives in a shared house. You can cut your nails in the house while someone is watching from the window. It was so easy to fly far away and reach this uninhabited land. That day was December 7, 1941. On December 8, the cannon sounded. With one shot after another, the silver mist of the winter morning gradually dispersed. On the mountaintops and in the valleys, the residents of the entire island looked towards the sea and said, "The war is starting. The war is starting." No one can believe it, but after all, a war has started. Liusu stayed alone in Barton Road. How could he know anything? By the time Ollie found out the news from the neighbors and hurriedly woke her up, a fierce war was already underway outside. There is a scientific laboratory near Barton Road. There is an anti-aircraft gun on the roof. Stray bullets keep flying over, making a long and sharp cry, "Gioa," and then bang, falling to the ground. The sound of squeaky "ah-uh" tore through the air and tore apart the nerves. The light blue sky was torn into strips, fluttering in the cold wind. The tips of countless severed nerves were floating in the wind at the same time. Old Mrs. Byside and said, "Since I asked you to go, just go." Is she so mean? Tears fell from her eyes. As she cried, she suddenly lost her self-control and found that she couldn't bear it anymore. In one autumn, she had already aged 2 years. She couldn't bear to grow old. So she left home for the second time and came to Hong Kong. On this trip, she had already lost the sense of joyful adventure she had last time. She failed. Of course, women like to be surrendered, but that is only within a certain range. If she was purely conquered by Fan Liuyuan's grace and charm, that would be another story. But it was also mixed with family pressure, the most painful ingredient. If she officially becomes Mrs. Fan, she will have all kinds of responsibilities, and she can't live without people. Now she is just Fan Liuyuan's mistress, faceless. She should avoid people, and people should avoid her. It was quiet, but it was a pity that she had no other interests besides people. The little knowledge she has is all about dealing with people. With this ability, she can be a virtuous daughter-in-law and an attentive mother. Here she is useless as a hero. As long as he keeps the house, he has no home to support. As long as he takes care of the children, Liuyuan doesn't want any children at all. As long as she lives frugally, she doesn't have to worry about money at all. How will she spend the next few years? Go in to play cards with Mrs. Zhu or watch a show. Then gradually, he started sleeping with actors, smoking opium, and go into the concubine's way. She suddenly stopped, holding out her chest and twisting her hands tightly behind her back. That's not the case. She's not a nasty person. She can control herself. But can she control herself from going crazy? The 3 rooms in the Pinsy style upstairs and the 3 rooms in the Pinsy style downstairs are all decorated with lights. The newly waxed floor shines brightly. No one was round, room after room, shouting emptiness. Liusu lay down on the bed and wanted to go down and turn off the light, but couldn't move. Later, she heard Ollie walking upstairs with his wooden clogs, turning off the light and bawled all the way, and her tense nerves gradually relaxed. Chapter 9. Liusu only thought that he was dead, but who knew he was still alive? When I opened my eyes, I saw a swarm of glass shards and a swarm of sun shadows. She struggled to get up and went to find Ollie. Liuyuan sighed. This explosion has broken the tale of so many stories. Liusu was also sad, and after a while he said, "If you are killed by the explosion, my story will be over. If you are killed by the explosion, your story will still be long." Liuyuan laughed and said, "Are you going to keep the holiday for me?" Both of them were a little crazy, and they laughed in unison for no reason. And he couldn't stop laughing. After laughing, I was trembling all over. Repulse Bay was relatively calm for the first 2 days, but then the situation suddenly changed and gradually became heated. There was no shelter upstairs and no one could find shelter. They all came downstairs and stood guard in the canteen. The glass door of the canteen was wide open and sandbags were piled in front of the door. The British soldiers set up cannons there to shoot out. The warships in the bay pinpointed the source of the shells and returned the salute one by one. Across the palm trees and the fountain, bullets flew back and forth. Liusu's house is empty, and his heart is empty. There is no rice at home, so his stomach is also empty. It came out of nowhere, so she felt the terrifying attack particularly intensely. I called Zhu's house in Happy Valley but couldn't get through for a long time, because no one with a phone in the city was calling to ask which area was safer and to make an evacuation plan. Liusu only connected the phone in the afternoon, but even though the phone rang, no one came to answer the call. Mr. Zhu and Mrs. Zhu must have left in a hurry and moved to a more peaceful area. Liusu ran out of ideas. The artillery fire gradually became more intense. The nearby anti-aircraft guns became the focus of the aircraft's attention. The aircraft camp circled the top. ZZZ, going around in a circle and back again. ZZ. The pain was like a dentist's spiral appliance, going straight into the depths of the soul. Ollie was sitting on the threshold of the living room holding her crying child. She seemed to be in a coma, swaying from side to side, murmuring songs that sounded like whispers, and coaxing and patting the child. The window collapsed and there was another squeak. And bang. A corner of the eaves was cut off, and sand and gravel fell down. Ollie screamed, jumped up, hugged the child and ran out. Liusu caught up with her at the gate, grabbed her and asked, "Where are you going?" Ollie said, "You can't squat here. I'll take him to the gutter to hide." Liusu said, "You're crazy. Go and die." Ollie said repeatedly, "Let me go. This child of mine, the only one, can't die. Hide in the gutter." Liusu, after desperately holding on to her, Ollie pushed her. She fell, and Ollie rushed out of the door. At this moment, there was a loud bang and the whole world went dark, like a huge box with the lid snapped shut. Countless Luochachi hates are all locked up inside. As soon as the door opened, Ollie hugged the child tightly, lowered his head, and pressed his forehead against the cement wall in the doorway. He was shocked and confused. Liusu pulled her in, and she heard noises outside saying that a bomb had fallen next door and a big crater had been blown up in the garden. This time there was a loud noise, and the lid of the box was closed, but there was still no silence. The banging continued, as if hammering nails on the lid of the box, pounding endlessly, from dawn to dusk, and from dusk to dawn. When Liusu reached this point, she regretted that Liuyuan was by her side. She seemed to have two bodies, and she was in double danger. A bullet might not hit her, but it might hit him. If he died or became disabled, her situation would be even more unimaginable. If she was injured, she would have no choice but to die for fear of dragging him down. Even if he died, he would not die cleanly and alone. She expected Liuyuan to think so too. She didn't know anything else. At this moment, she only had him, and he only had her. The next day, Liusu, Ollie and her son finished eating a few biscuits in the jar separately, and their spirits gradually weakened. Every fragment of the whizzing bullet was like an ear scraper hitting her face. A military truck rumbled down the street and unexpectedly stopped in front of the door. As soon as the bell rang, Liusu went to open the door. When she saw it was Liuyuan, she grabbed his hand and hugged his arm tightly, just like Ollie hugging a child. She jumped forward and knocked her head on the cement in the doorway. On the wall, Liuyuan held her head with his other hand and said hurriedly, "Are you frightened? Don't worry. You go pack some useful things, and we'll go to Repulse Bay. Hurry. Liusu stumbled and rushed in, asking, Isn't it okay at Repulse Bay? Liuyuan said. They said they won't land there. And there is no problem with food in the hotel. They have a rich collection, Liusu said. Your ship? Liuyuan said. The ship didn't sail out. They sent the first-class passengers to the Repulse Bay Hotel. They were supposed to pick you up yesterday, but they couldn't get a car and the bus couldn't be crowded. Go! I finally managed to get this Wu car today. Liusu couldn't make up his mind to pack his luggage, so he randomly tied up a small package. Liuyuan gave Ollie 2 months' wages and asked her to look after the house. The two of them got into the car and lay face down side by side in the cargo compartment covered with a yellow-green oilcloth awning. They bumped along the way, bending their elbows and knees. The skin on it is all worn out. There was a truce. The men and women trapped in the Repulse Bay Hotel slowly walked towards the city. After passing the lowest cliff, the red clay cliff, and the red clay cliff, and the lowest cliff again, I almost suspected that I had taken the wrong road, so I went back. However, no, there was no such exploding pit on the previous road, full of stones. Liuyuan and Liusu rarely spoke. They used to have a few words while riding in the car, but now they have walked dozens of miles on the road and have nothing to say. Occasionally, if there is a sentence, halfway through the sentence, the other party will usually know what is going on, and there is no need to say anything further. Liuyuan said, "Look, it's on the beach." Liusu said, "Yes." The beach is covered with barbed wire fences that are broken horizontally and vertically. Outside the barbed wire fence, the pale white seawater swallows the pale yellow sand. Sunny days in winter are also indifferent blue. The season of wild sparkles is over, Liusu said. That wall, Liuyuan said. I didn't even go to see it. Liusu sighed and said, forget it. Yuan became hot after walking, so he took off his coat and put it on his arms, which were also sweating. Liusu said, you are afraid of the heat. Let me hold it for you. In the past, Yuan would never have refused, but now he was not so gentlemanly and actually handed it over to her. After walking for a while, the mountain gradually got higher. I don't know whether it was the wind blowing the trees or the drifting cloud shadows, but the green and yellow foothills slowly darkened. When you look closely, it's not the wind or the clouds, it's the sun slowly moving over the mountains, half of the foothills buried in a huge blue shadow. There are several houses burning and smoking on the mountain. The smoke is white on the yin side of the mountain and black smoke on the yang side of the mountain, but the sun just moves slowly over the top of the mountain. Liuyuan and Liusu followed everyone and pressed their backs against the wall of the hall. The dark background is like an ancient Persian carpet, woven with various characters, including lords, princesses, talented men, and beauties. The blanket was hung on a bamboo pole, and the wind beat the dust on it. It was beaten so hard that the people on it were helpless. When the cannonballs were fired this way, they ran to that side. When the cannonballs were fired that way, they ran to this side. Eventually, an open hall was riddled with holes, and one wall collapsed. There was no way to escape, so I had to sit down on the ground and resign myself to fate. The truck arrived at Repulse Bay in a net of squeaky stray bullets. There are troops stationed downstairs in the Repulse Bay Hotel, and they still live in the old rooms upstairs. After we settled in, we discovered that although the hotel had plenty of storage, it was all reserved for the soldiers. In addition to canned milk, beef and mutton, and fruits, there are also sacks of white bread. Bread. The guests were given only to soda crackers or to sugar cubes for each meal, and everyone was dying of hunger. Liusu also thought of Liuyuan, wondering whether his ship had sailed out of the port or been sunk. But when she thought of him, she felt a little lost, as if she was a lifetime away. The current section has nothing to do with her past, like a song on the radio that suddenly started crackling and bursting due to the bad weather halfway through the song. After the bombing is over, the song will still have to be sung. But if the bombing is over and the song is over, then there will be no need to listen to it. Chapter 10. Liusu only went back to the Bai mansion once, just for fear that people would talk too much and cause trouble. However, trouble is inevitable. The fourth grandma decided to divorce the fourth master, and everyone was behind Liusu's decision. Liusu divorced and remarried, but she had such amazing achievements. No wonder others want to follow her example. Liusu squatted in the shadow of the lamp and lit mosquito incense. Thinking of fourth grandma, she smiled. Liuyuan never plays tricks with her now. He saved his wisecracks for the woman next to him. That was a good sign to be thankful for, as it meant that he treated her completely as one of his own, a legitimate wife. However, Liusu was still a little disappointed. Liuyuan stopped and looked for a long time, feeling the ordinary horror, suddenly shuddered, and said to Liusu, "Now you should believe it, the life and death contract is broad. Where did we have the final say? During the bombing." "What an accident," Liusu said angrily. "At this time, you still say that you can't make the decision." Liuyuan smiled and said, "I'm not giving up. What I mean is," he looked at her face and smiled, said, "No more, no more." They kept walking. Liuyuan said again, "By some strange coincidence, we really fell in love." Liusu said, "You said you loved me a long time ago." Liuyuan smiled and said, "That doesn't count. We were too busy falling in love at that time. How could we have time for love?" They sent her out that day. Liusu stood on the threshold. Liuyuan stood behind her, put his palms on hers, and said with a smile, "I said, when will we get married?" Liusu listened without saying a word. Just he lowered his head and shed tears. Liuyuan took her hand and said, "Come on. Let's go to the newspaper office today to publish the notice. But you may be willing to wait a little longer. Wait for us to return to Shanghai, make a grand show, and invite relatives." Liusu said, "Bah, they deserve it too." As he said this, he laughed out loud, fell back and leaned against him. Liuyuan stretched out his hand in front of her face and said, crying and laughing again, "He is just a selfish man, and she is just a selfish woman. In this area of chaos and chaos, there is no place for individualists, but there is always room for an ordinary couple." Ollie disappeared without a trace, but the owners of the house still had to live without her. They didn't have time to tidy up a house, so they went to get food first. They went through a lot of trouble and bought a bag of rice at a high price. Fortunately, the gas supply was not cut off, but the running water was not. Liuyuan took a lead bucket to the mountains to draw a bucket of spring water and started cooking. From now on, they will only be busy eating, drinking and cleaning the room every day. Liuyuan was good at all kinds of menial tasks, sweeping and mopping the floor, and helping Liusu twist the heavy sheets. Liusu cooked on the stove for the first time, and it actually brought out the flavor of her hometown. Because Liuyuan couldn't forget Malay food, she also learned to make fried sandbags and curry fish. Although they felt unprecedented interest in food, they still tried their best to save money. Liuyuan didn't have much Hong Kong dollars with him, so once they got a ship, they had to find a way to get back to Shanghai. The hall was filled with dust and pigeon droppings. When Liusu reached the top of the stairs, she couldn't help but exclaim, "Oh!" On the second floor, there were her new boxes and cages lying crookedly with their mouths wide open. Two of them rolled down the stairs, and the latter feet were submerged in the silk and satin. In the torrent, Liusu bent down and picked up a honey-colored velvet-lined cheongsam, but it was not her own. It was full of sweat, cigarette hulls, and the smell of cheap perfume. She also found many strange women's supplies, broken magazines, and open cans of Likes dripping with residual juice, mixed in a pile of her clothes. Were there any troops stationed in this house? British soldiers with women? It seemed like he went in a hurry. Most of the local poor farmers who ransacked from house to house had never visited, otherwise, they would not have left all this behind. Liuyuan helped her call Ollie loudly. The last gray-backed pigeon pierced through the thorns and flew out through the yellow sunlight in the doorway. There are legends everywhere, but they don't necessarily have such a happy ending. The Hukan played dumbly, pulling it back and forth in the night, with thousands of lights, telling endless desolate stories, even if you don't ask. Liusu sat surrounded by quilts and listened to the sad wind. She did know that the gray brick wall near Repulse Bay must still be standing there. The wind stopped, like three gray dragons, hanging on the wall, their silver scales shining in the moonlight. As if in a dream, she came to the foot of the wall again and came face to face with Liuyuan. She finally met Yanagihara. One day, they were shopping for groceries on the street and met Princess Sahaisini. Sahaini had a sullen face and had her fluffy braids randomly braided into a bun. She wore a green cotton robe borrowed from somewhere, but she still wore Indian-style 7 treasure inlaid leather slippers at her feet. She shook hands with them warmly, asked them where they lived now, and was eager to see their new house. He also noticed that there were oysters with the shells removed from Liusu's basket, and was willing to learn how to make steamed oyster soup from Liusu. Yanagihara invited her to have a casual meal, and she happily went back with them. Her Englishman had gone to a concentration camp, and she was now living in the home of an Indian policeman whom she knew well and who often worked for her. She hadn't had enough to eat in a long time. She called Liusu Miss Bai. Liuan smiled and said, "This is my wife. You should say congratulations to me." Sahishini said, "Really? When did you get married?" Liuan shrugged and said, "It was published in China News Notice. You know, marriages during wars are always messy." Liusu didn't understand what they said. Sahaisini kissed him and kissed her. However, their food was very cold and bitter after all, and Yanagihara declared that it was rare for them to eat oyster soup. Sahaisini never came to visit again. The two of them walked into the city together, and when they reached a winding place, the road suddenly dropped, and in front of them, there was nothing but an ethereal sky, a lighting-colored, humid sky. A foreign porcelain signboard was picked out at the small iron gate and it read, "Zhao Zhangqing Dentist." The wind blew the iron hooks on the signboard squeaking, but behind the signboard was only the ethereal sky. September 1943. The legendary people who conquered the country and conquered the city were generally like this. The fall of Hong Kong fulfilled her destiny. But in this unreasonable world, who knows what is cause and what is effect? Who knows? Maybe because of trying to fulfill her, a metropolis collapsed. Thousands of people died, thousands of people suffered, and earth-shattering reforms followed. Liusu didn't feel that her position in history was subtle. She just stood up with a smile and kicked the mosquito incense tray under the table. The wedding announcement was published in the newspaper, and Mr. Zhu and Mrs. Zhu rushed over to congratulate them. Liusu felt unhappy because they were moving to a safe area on their own during the siege, regardless of her life or death, but she could only welcome them with a smile. Liuan organized a banquet and invited a guest. Soon, traffic between Hong Kong and Shanghai was restored, and they returned to Shanghai. After all, living in Hong Kong after the disaster is not a long-term solution. I was so busy during the day and just got over it. At night, in that dead city, there are no lights, no human voices, only the vast cold wind, 3 different scales. Oh, woo, endlessly calling. This break okay, that one gradually started ringing again. 3 parallel gray dragons flew forward in a straight line, their bodies extending indefinitely, with no tail visible. Oh, ha, woo. After the cry, even the blue dragon was gone, only 3 emptiness chi. A bridge of vacuum, leading into the darkness, into the void of the void. Everything is finished here. There are only a few broken walls and ruins left, and civilized people who have lost their memory stumble around in the dusk, as if they are looking for something, but in fact everything is lost. In this turbulent world, money, real estate, and everything that lasts forever are all unreliable. The only things she could rely on were the breath in her mouth, and the person sleeping next to her. She suddenly crawled to Liuan and tucked him across his quilt. He reached out from under the covers and took her hand. They saw each other transparently, and it was only a moment of complete understanding. But this moment was enough for them to live harmoniously together for 10 or 8 years. When I got home, I opened the ajar door and a flock of pigeons flew out with flapping wings.
Alright, this story has come to an end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.